So this morning we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about a group that was actually born out of this meeting last year, and that's the Cattle Traceability Working Group. To give you a little bit of perspective, when we had this traceability meeting last year, we had obviously a good dialogue with the USDA, and some of the key ADT advancement points came forward. And the sense of a lot of the attendees is that we wanted to make sure we had a strong industry, a strong and independent industry voice that can vet some of the topics, look at this from the different perspectives of the different stakeholders within our industry, and provide an independent perspective of ultimately how we can progress the ADT system into something that can be more than it is today. I want to commend you to the booklet you got with the agenda. In the back, it basically talks about the Cattle Traceability Working Group. And I will review the purpose and the goal of this group, again, just to give us a little bit of footing of what the group is trying to do and how we're trying to interact to move the ADT topic forward. The purpose of the Cattle Traceability Working Group is to work collaboratively across the various segments of the cattle industry to enhance the traceability of animals for the purposes of protecting animal health and market access. The Cattle Traceability Working Group will strive to create consensus among all stakeholders on key components of the system so there's an equitable sharing of costs, benefits, and responsibility across the industry segments. The overarching goal of the Cattle Traceability Working Group is to enhance cattle identification and traceability to a level that serves the needs of producers, marketers, exporters, and animal health officials. So with that, some 45 people began this effort and the journey to develop consensus. As we did this and came together, and it was as simple as people raising their hands, getting on a mailing list, jumping on a first conference call, we started putting some structure to this, and we understood that we had unique perspectives. We all represented different perspectives, whether we were from industry, whether we were from associations, producer groups, what have you. But also there were key topic perspectives that we had a lot of subject matter expertise on, and we wanted people to do deep dive in areas of relevance. So we ended up breaking our group into 5 subgroups or working groups to really tackle some of the specific topics that were of relevance to the different stakeholders. These groups included communication and transparency, collection technology, responsibilities and opportunities, information liability, and data storage and access. The working groups, with the exception of communications, and I'll touch on that in a second, are represented on the panel here this morning. And what we're going to try to do is give you an update of the types of things that have been discussed, the structure that's put in place to vet and develop consensus, and ultimately where we've progressed on a couple of the key topics. So we want this to be very interactive. We want to be able to share with you the progress, but we really want to understand from your perspective, are we fulfilling our purpose? Are we meeting the goals? And are we moving this forward in a manner that makes sense to you? And this is really a chance for us to do a little bit of a reality check to make sure that we're aligned with you guys and ultimately more aligned with the broader market itself. Each of the subgroups have established regular communication and conference calls which have progressed several key topics. And a lot of that you're going to hear is focused on those 14 key points that came out of the USDA document that was published last April. On a weekly basis, the co-chairs, and you've got 4 of the co-chairs up here right now, meet on a conference call as well, more to look at where we've got consensus building across the different groups, and also just to manage some logistic things. We do intend to put out some statements as far as position, some statements as far as how we see moving forward on some key topics, and to do that, we have to have some process. So we kind of learned as we got through this, we needed voting processes, we needed procedures to bring discussions to the broader group, because at some point it needs to come out of these working groups into the broader Cattle Traceability Working Group and create a vetting and voting process that will create firm positions as far as what we think will help move this forward. And that's really the function of the co-chair group and the people, again, you see represented up here today. As we hand this over to the co-chairs to give you the update on the progress and focus on what's been done to date, I want to give you a couple of things to keep in mind. The Cattle Traceability Working Group is not a committee or a subgroup of NIAA, and that's not us trying to distance from anybody, but it's really important for everybody to understand we're not beholden to NIAA or any group or association, nor does any group or association have to listen to us. We're trying to advance a topic. We're trying to give a good forum for vetting these things and move some topics forward. We've created a really good working relationship that we're really fortunate to have with USDA and having some good dialogue back and forth and making sure that we don't overcommit and create expectations of what USDA may or may not be willing or able to do. And trying to build that consensus not only of industry, but understanding what's reality, what are things that we can really accomplish together with the federal and state officials to make sure we have a well-synchronized system as we move forward. The final point here is make sure that you get your input today and continually with this group. NIAA has done a great job facilitating. This topic, as you know, for years and years has been an important topic, the traceability topic to NIAA, and they've been kind enough to facilitate a lot of the work, a lot of the conference calls. Logistically, Katie and Angela help us a lot keeping things on the rails. But in the end, again, this is a group that hopefully does your work, not the work of any particular or individual association or group. So with that, I'll stop for a moment, and if you guys have any questions broadly on the structure, again, these are the folks that drive a lot of the discussion. Myself, along with Neville Spear and Tony Forshee, kind of try to help logistically put some of these things in context. So I'll be happy to talk towards any of those questions or concerns that the group might have right now. But then I'd like to move on to the real work that's being done within our subgroups and let you get a sense as to what are the topics we're vetting and what are the things that we're wrestling with right now. So I'll stop for a moment. Are there any overarching questions as we begin? And certainly we'll have more opportunity after we get the group presentations to entertain more questions. But any questions at this point? All right. Very good. I don't know who lost the coin flip and wants to go first. Chuck, you're right here. So Chuck Adami, Responsibilities and Opportunities Group.
Good morning. I appreciate the chance to speak to this group. I'm a co-chair of the Responsibility and Opportunities Task Group. The other co-chair of our group is Joe Leathers. I thought I'd start out by telling you the objective, the written objective that we have in our group. It is to fully identify and understand the responsibilities at the various levels of the industry regarding identification, application, maintenance, and reporting in order to evaluate the true costs and benefits of an enhanced traceability system. We're to provide guidance in all industry segments on implementation of components of an enhanced traceability system and identifying cost-sharing opportunities to minimize impact at all levels. We began our work in September of last year, and it started out very slowly. We had a difficult time because we didn't have a structure in place in order to be able to vet it. And if any of you have been involved in this for any period of time, what you fully realize is that when you start a discussion, it bogs down because you talk about the same thing over and over and over and over. So we set a structure up such that we could identify points, and we utilized the proposals in the state and federal working group white paper that they came out with, and we set those proposals up as a framework on how we were going to try and move forward with enhanced traceability. Our group is roughly 14 members that range from producers to organizations, breed organizations, or farm organizations. There are some individuals and some livestock marketing members. The first thing that we did was we identified within the USDA 14 proposed topics which ones that we felt in our group we should discuss and have input. Of those 14, we had 5 that we felt we didn't need to be working on the preliminary portion of this. We would wait till the discussion came back to the full group, and then we would give our input. After identifying those, we set about putting them into a listing where we felt which ones of these 14 proposals should we deal with first. I'm sure everybody is aware of the proposals. I'll read them quickly. Number 1 is interstate movements that do not apply to the traceability regulations. Number 2 was cattle population covered in the official identification regulations. 3, limiting official identification requirements to interstate movements. 4, electronic identification system for cattle. 5, the administration of electronic records. 6, the enforcement of ADT regulations. 7, the collection of ID and its correlation to the carcass at slaughter plants. 8, public and private information system. 9, exemptions from official identification requirements. 10, ICVI exemptions and movement documents. 11, uniformity of state regulations. 12, uniform official identification ear tags. 13, official EID tag for imported cattle. And then 14, official identification of beef feeders. When we set our hierarchy, we began with item number 2, cattle population in the official identification regulations. The second one we worked on is official identification of beef feeders. And the third that we'll work on is the electronic identification system for cattle. So I've gotten a little ahead of myself. I've told you what we've worked on so far, and the others that we have not begun work, although we have had general discussion about those issues because they play or interplay with the ones that we're talking about. The first one that we did work on, cattle population covered in the official identification regulations. After some work, and you have to understand that most of this work is by telephone conference call. Trying to get together and meet is cost prohibitive. We meet almost weekly by conference call to discuss these items. And it takes quite a while to get through an item. In any case, we did come up with a proposed discussion item for number 2. Our structure says that if any group has an item that they feel it is time from their viewpoint that it should be discussed by the entire group, the mechanism is to push it out to all the members of the Cattle Traceability Working Group, give a 28-day notice of discussion. The conference call will then be initiated, and on this particular item, this conference call will take place on Friday of this week. After the conference call, there is a 7-day period of time that all members can vote, and it'll be by a doodle poll or some polling system on the internet. I won't get into exactly what our group proposed because I may be putting the cart before the horse. This has to go to the full membership. It may come out after the discussion. It may be rejected, it may be changed, or it may be accepted in its entirety. So talking about it today is probably counterproductive because there is a chance that it will not be agreed to by all the groups to move forward. The second issue that we are tackling, and we have not finished this issue, is official identification of beef feeders. From our group, because we have a responsibility, we're concerned about in this area, when does it happen? How does it happen? And who's going to do it? Those questions are the ones that we're tossing around currently with the hopes that we'll get to the end and then push directly up again to the full membership a proposal on how we should react to official identification of beef feeders. That's where we are today. We hope to continue and hope that this process moves a little quicker as we get to the items that we feel aren't as important to our group as they may be to other groups. That's all I have.
Good morning. Thanks, Chuck. We went through a lot of the same beginning points, setting our objectives that Chuck mentioned, so I won't go back through all of that, but as a group, I think each of the task groups kind of did that. I'm the co-chair along with Glenn for the Collection Technology Task Group. So we started out by identifying all of the segments in the industry and the current technology that they're using, looked at all of the, from cow-calf on up through the packer. Worked through that, discussed, like I said, all of the different technologies currently being used, pros and cons of each of those. Then we moved on to the ADT, the 14 points report, and identified those points that we thought as the technology task group should tackle and review. Obviously, the major one for us was number 4, the electronic identification system for cattle was a major one. That's where we've spent the majority of our time. We've discussed a few of the other ones, collection of ID and its correlation to the carcass at slaughter plants. And we have not yet gotten into further down in the report as far as the uniform official identification ear tags, the official ID for imported cattle, and then also the big topic of beef feeders. As a group, we've decided to currently stay on the current ADT system with cattle 18 months and older. So as we move through this, and I will cover most of what we covered in point number 4 as far as the EID system for cattle. We did come to, after reviewing all of the segments and their current technology, we did come to a clear consensus that RFID is the technology that we need to go to, and I think that goes along with what Dr. Scheer talked about yesterday, and I think the industry appears to be getting closer to a full consensus point on that. We did not come up with a consensus as far as low frequency or ultra high frequency. We think the markets will determine that. There's different uses, different markets prefer the different technologies, so we think that the market's going to have to drive that potential choice. Or we're looking at maybe the technology companies to provide and accommodate for a dual ultra high frequency, low frequency type readers, so that the markets can, regardless of what cattle comes through, they can read both types of technology. We're also watching the trials that are going on that they spoke about yesterday with Kansas and Texas, Kentucky, Florida, those trials to see what their results are and if they come up with any technology that they feel is one outweighs the other. as we look through the technology solutions, we needed to focus on the growth of the infrastructure and how that's going to impact it. If we choose one technology at this point and the infrastructure doesn't support it yet, or if we outgrow that infrastructure too soon, we need to consider those points. We talked a lot about the timeline. We have a date set of 2023, but it's hard to say, okay, as of January 1, 2023, we're going to go to this. We talked more of steps towards moving towards that final implementation date, maybe a staging or transition period. Do we sunset the bright tags or visual tags over the next 2 years or the next year? What does that timeline look like? What does that sunset look like? And how do we gradually get to that 2023 goal? So with that, talking about sunsetting bright tags, implementing new technology, it led us quickly to funding. And I think as they talked yesterday, Dr. Shearer, that's a big issue. How are we going to fund this? Currently, your bright tags are provided. So do we expect producers to incur that cost of an EID when they're not used to paying for tags? How do we transition that? And I think that was talked about yesterday too, as far as the funding. And do we look at a possible reduction where we have some funding up front to help people get involved in the system, start getting EIDs purchased, and then over time that funding decreases? But I think as far as the infrastructure, that's the key, is when we're asking people to put in the readers or whatever infrastructure and they need to do this, is where's that money going to come from? So that's basically what we've been working on. Like I said, we're still looking at its different technologies. How does the market determine that? And we're looking for input. And, what does the industry, like Glenn had said, this is a time for us to collect your input and what you all feel is the best. So we will continue to work on those other points and see if we can develop more industry consensus. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You're going to have to put up with me again this morning. Catherine Britton, our co-chair of the Information Liability Subgroup, could not be with us today. Chelsea Good has been a huge benefit to our working group as we've worked on this issue. Before I get into the white paper, which we had hoped would be available for distribution at the conference, but is still going through some edits, primarily just choice of words by attorneys not that familiar with the livestock industry, so there needs to be some touch-up on that so we can avoid confusion. I think that's understandable. Our working group, our subgroup, has also tackled the ADT 14-point document and spent quite a bit of time with that document. Feeder cattle, the addition, the timing of if and when feeder cattle and how those get added to the ADT process or to some type of official traceability process has garnered a lot of discussion as well. But given the limited time today, I wanted to spend it on this white paper, draft white paper. So I've summarized it in a few slides, and we'll just walk through those. I don't know if it's wise for a non-attorney to be giving an overview of a legal document, but I promised Chelsea that I would pay her after the conference if she would answer all the difficult questions. Just out of curiosity, how many attorneys, besides Chelsea, how many attorneys do we have in the room? Okay, Craig. All right, well, good. The non-attorneys are in the majority. All right, so our group owes a special thanks, because it was pro bono work, to Elizabeth Rumley and Tiffany Dow-Lashman, respectively at the National Ag Law Center and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, the two attorneys that did the bulk of this research and writing. Our working group had several conference calls developing an outline for the two authors to use. We engaged some private sector attorneys that have experience in this area of law and had an interest in it, and had conference calls with them as well, further refined the outline, and then turned it over to Beth and Tiffany to generate the document. The two primary issues, obviously, being issues of confidentiality and liability, and we talked about that during some of the Q&A yesterday. So starting first with the federally mandated traceability system and the issue of data confidentiality under that, we have the privacy law, which is somewhat of an overarching umbrella on protecting information that individuals share with the government. But as in most legal areas, there are exemptions and exceptions and other carve-outs that make it interesting as to how this might all play out in the future. So that addresses, as I noted, the unnecessary exchange of personal information. So then Congress enacted FOIA, or Freedom of Information. And there are exceptions under FOIA as to what you can get access to, or the public or activist groups or anyone might get access to as we go forward with an ID and traceability system, database management issues, and protecting that, protecting producer information. So under FOIA, you can request agency records, but there are exemptions as well to protect those requests. There are statutory exemptions. Interestingly enough, in the 2008 Farm Bill, there was a specific statutory exemption as to information provided by producers about their agricultural operations to USDA. And Congress specifically exempted that information and protected it. It was later challenged. There was a media request by a reporter that wanted access to under the NIAA, the previous NIAA program that we've talked about during this conference, the National Repository for Premise Identification, the NPIR. USDA denied that request under current statutes, and the courts supported USDA. So as we talked during the Q&A system, or process yesterday, there should be there is quite a bit of protection today for protecting information, and there may be a need at the federal and state level moving forward to further refine that. Confidentiality issues under state-mandated traceability systems. There are FOIA laws, sunshine laws in every state. They vary considerably. Some are more wide open than others. The ones that have state-specific protection of animal ID on the books today are Alabama and Georgia. Those are not the only states, but those are two primary major cattle-producing states. There is little uniformity, which I don't think would surprise any of you. There's little uniformity that exists among states on sunshine laws, which is dissimilar from an example would be the Uniform Commercial Code. If you have any experience with that, on liens, agricultural liens, etc., there's been a major initiative through over decades across the states to modernize and to make similar across the states the UCC. That does not exist in the issue that we're talking about today. Another issue under confidentiality is an industry-led traceability system or private sector database management. These are not subject to federal or state FOIA laws, but they are subject to private contractual agreements and contract law. Those would be between two or multiple parties, so those are issues that are going to have to be addressed as we move forward. And all of that would be subject to subpoena power. If there was a dispute or a disagreement that ended up in court, as the attorneys noted in the paper, you could be subpoenaed. But usually those subpoenas do not lead to the public disclosure of information. That's not always the case, but it is in a lot of instances. Shifting gears from issues of confidentiality to producer liability, which I think that's the bottom line question that a lot of people have, is as we move forward with animal ID and traceability and expand information that we may be sharing amongst ourselves or among state or federal animal health officials, what additional increase in liability occurs. The authors noted that traceability on its own will not expand producer liability. Those issues have always existed, and we talked about that a little bit. The group did during the Q&A session yesterday. But identification does, up and down the chain, does increase, for lack of a better term, accountability, the term they used, accountability. And that that's compared and contrasted to anonymity. I think we talked yesterday during the Q&A session that even though there's not a significantly robust traceability system in the cattle industry today, there are ways to trace back from the retailer to the packing plant to the feed yard, stocker, cow-calf. It takes time. It takes a lot more time than we would hope if we're chasing a disease trace back and trying to stop and shut down animal movement to protect the herd. But in other issues, time may not be quite so sensitive. So traceback, as the authors noted, traceback capabilities exist today. Liabilities are also governed under tort law. You really start getting in the weeds with the attorneys, and I may need some help, Chelsea, when we get into tort law. But three of those major areas that you'll see when this paper is released that the authors covered in it are warranty, strict liability, and negligence. And under warranty, you get into the implied warranty of merchantability. So if you're a merchant selling a product, whether it's a widget or an animal, there are some implied warranties that you're selling products to the public that are in a good state of condition. They don't have disease. They don't have other blemishes. But there are debates within the states and within the courts as to whether or not livestock producers are merchants. So there's a gray area of the law. In fact, in a number of states, livestock producers don't fall under these same legal responsibilities as merchants of other types. Excuse me. Apologize for my voice. Merchants of other types of products. Some of the things that are considered are the experience, the degree of business skill. I believe there were 4. I didn't list them all, and there's probably a longer list that get into those kind of decisions by the court. The courts are divided on this issue, which is not a surprise. It's very fact-specific, as is a lot of development of case law, that old adage that bad facts makes bad law, or good facts makes good law, certainly would be applicable to this. Just as an example, and I believe this was a Wisconsin case of an E. coli traceback, that in the end, the jury awarded and the court system supported, and it went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, if I remember, and the damages were awarded 80% to the packer, 20% to the restaurant. None of these cases to date, at least that I'm aware of, and Chelsea, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've identified any cases that have been traced back, or let me say it this way, that liability has passed back to the producer. And as we noted in our Q&A yesterday, feed yards are pretty easy to find beyond that packing plant. Another producer liability is the statutory limitation on warranties that the authors covered, and limits on livestock warranties in several states. So again, livestock is separate and treated differently than most other products when we get into this legal discussion of producer liability or merchant liability. There are express warranty issues that could arise. Those usually are covered by contract law, so I'll let you worry about that between your other business partner and both of your attorneys, or multiple attorneys, depending upon the size of the debate. And then there are products liability issues that were discussed. Animals are not considered, as I mentioned, products in many states, and the authors go into some detail on that. The other issue under producer liability would be negligence or failure to exercise reasonable care. Reasonable care in the production of a safe and wholesome food product, I think, would be most of what comes to mind first as far as a liability traceback. Most likely an issue for producers. What a reasonably prudent person would do is the legal test that usually gets put before the court or before the jury. And then a failure to exercise reasonable care would be a significant test in a case like this. Again, very fact-specific and usually determined by a jury. So in conclusion, the law surrounding animal traceability system is not entirely clear. It needs further clarification, as we've talked about during Q&A, whether that be on a state level or a federal level. We need to continue as we move forward with building systems, be very mindful of confidentiality, data protection, and liability. In fact, if we can't, as we've experienced, I think you all have when we talk about database management, if we can't ensure the producers that the data going into these databases is protected, they won't be putting data into those databases. That was made loud and clear to us as we've been establishing our pilot project. And then as we've talked, we need to be mindful of and keep considering the possibility of federal or state changes. So I want to thank again Beth and Tiffany for all the time and effort they put into the paper. I hope that it will be available to you through NIAA in a couple of weeks. So thank you.
Good morning. Chelsea Good with Livestock Marketing Association. Glenn talked a little bit about how this cattle traceability working group got put together. For those of you who were at that NIAA Traceability Forum in Denver last fall, I call it, it was Joe Leather's Noah's Ark speech. He, we were talking a lot about the state federal working group and the 14 recommendations that they came up with. And he got up and he's like, well, why doesn't industry get a group? And we'll get, 2 cow-calf people and 2 stalker people and 2 market people and 2 feedlot people and 2 packers. And we'll just figure it out. Well, the group got bigger than that. But I am lucky to have been one of the people that, from the Livestock Marketing Association perspective, that's been working on this group along with one of my board members, Tim Starks from Oklahoma. And because nothing's stronger than the heart of a volunteer, I also ended up becoming a subcommittee co-chairperson in this group of the Data Storage and Access Subcommittee. So Terry Frankhauser of Colorado Cattlemen is the co-chair of that Data Storage and Access Subcommittee along with myself. That subcommittee has been tasked with identifying data storage and access options and requirements that have the highest potential to ensure all traceability data is stored and made accessible to authorized users, so mostly animal health officials, in a secured matter that also protects all levels of our industry. So that is kind of the main charge of this data storage and access subgroup. Similar to the other subgroups, what we did is we looked at those 14 points coming out of the state federal working group and kind of determined, well, which of these most clearly fit with what we've been tasked to do. And the first one that we worked on, and probably the one we focused on the most, is the number 8, which talks about public and or private data systems to store data. And the conversation of the subgroup has not probably advanced quite to the level that maybe the Responsibilities and Opportunities has, where they've put forward things for a vote. I think we'll probably follow with that. But we have created some consensus points within the subgroup. And probably the biggest consensus point is a point that is supportive of that number 8 data storage and access public-private information system group. And the piece that we're particularly supportive of is, regardless of this, if data, producer data, traceability data is stored in a public system or a private system, we are really supportive of the confidentiality and security of that data, that producer data is not shared. In particular, our subgroup feels like that data should only be shared in 2 scenarios. One, if a state or federal animal health official requests that data as a part of their official duties or doing a traceback. Or 2, if the person who submitted the information provides permission for its use. So that could be an example of a time that that data could be used maybe as a add-on or value-added component, but only if that producer providing that information gives permission for it to be used in that way. We took it a step further as our group, and we also had some conversations about aggregate information or aggregate data. And even if you strip away the individual producer name or address, we still feel like that aggregate data should not be used for private profit purposes, despite anonymizing the information, unless that permission has been received from all of the people whose information is aggregated together. So that's the main area that this subgroup has talked about. We do have two other subpoints. We've talked on some level about the difference in a bookend versus a full traceability system, and feel like, at least initially, in terms of building blocks, the bookend system is the area we need to focus on starting out, and that more discussion and consensus is going to be needed in addressing areas such as allowances for that initial identification. If it can't be identification on farm, where are the places that that initial identification can take place? And also talking more about harvest tag retirement as well. And then the final point that this subgroup has talked about is the standardization of that traceability data. And we are supportive of the subgroup that Dr. Scheer mentioned that is really working on the standardization on those ECVI fields of data. We want a chance to take a look at the results of that group, but we feel like that group is probably headed the right direction in terms of getting some standardizations in those different fields of data. So that's the main things that the data storage and access subgroup have been working on, and with that I will turn it back over, I think, to Glenn